Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be going back once again to the 19th century, and we're going to be looking at a very important historical figure, not just simply in the history of the United States, but also in the history of the African American community and the abolitionist movement.
Yeah, you know, Ray, as we are approaching the celebration of our nation's founding in just a little bit, we always think of the parades and the fireworks and the red, white, and blue. However, we have to understand that, especially during the time of Frederick Douglass and others, this wasn't a time of celebration for
Right.
all individuals. That there was a lot of animosity, a lot of hurt, because at the central forefront of all of this nation's stresses and problems was the concept of slavery. And this idea that not all people were truly equal, they didn't feel that they had the same rights as others. And so when we look at Independence Day meant one thing for some, and it meant a completely different connotation for others. And I think Frederick Douglass comes into this, and he recognizes the beauty of America, but also the struggles in America. Kind of some of the same issues we have today.
Yeah, Frederick Douglass, you know, of course, he is born into slavery in 1818 in a little place called Talbot County, Maryland. He's born to a Native American mother and an African American father, and he was actually born Frederick Bailey, and that's going to be much later. He's going to change his name to Douglas, but he is born there into slavery, and he is going to go through a number of different living situations in his early years. He's going to be separated from his mother, I think as a baby. I mean, very young, which of course was not unusual in the practice of slavery, where children or even adults would be sold away and families would be split up. So there was nothing very unusual there. But he did spend time, after being separated from his mom, he spent time with his grandmother, his maternal grandmother, Betty Bailey. But at 6 years old, he was moved to a plantation in Maryland. And then he was given to a guy called Thomas Auld, A-U-L-D, to work with his brother Hugh Auld there in Baltimore. And it's Auld's wife, Hugh's wife, a lady called Sophia, that Douglas sort of gives credit to for giving him or teaching him how to write, or teaching him the alphabet. And he starts using his ability to read and to write to teach other slaves how to read and write. And of course, word's going to spread of his ability and what he's doing. And Thomas Auld is going to then transfer him to a guy called Edward Covey, who's a farmer who had a reputation, Chris, of being a very harsh slave master. It's during this time that Frederick Douglass is going to be whipped quite a number of times by Covey. And so eventually, of course, Chris, Frederick Douglass is going to escape, and he's then going to go north.
Yeah, I think it's, as we go back and forth with Frederick Douglass' early life, I mean, he had a difficult early life, and he experienced a lot of things that we do not wish anyone to experience. And he saw the terrible aspect of slavery. And he also saw the pursuit of freedom in others. And he recognized that the only way that he could get out of the being enslaved was through education, the opportunity of being able to read. And I think that, he was not enrolled in any school. I mean, he self-taught himself. He found whatever books he could find, whatever he could do to really develop this understanding of literacy so that it could give him his freedom. And then, he had the help of the young free black woman named Anna Murray, who was willing to agree to help him escape. And, you have to understand, it was very hard just to leave the plantation, much less to concoct an elaborate ruse that would allow you to be able to escape. And we all know the punishments that would come for those who escaped but were later caught and brought back. But, Frederick Douglass, In 1838, he disguises himself as a sailor. He's able to board a train that's heading north to New York City, and he uses funds that had been given to him from Anna to be able to head up to New York on that train. He goes to New York. He becomes, declares himself free, and as soon as he escapes from slavery, he begins this pursuit with abolition. The idea that I've seen it, I've experienced it, I know what it's all about, and I'm going to do everything that I can to really make sure that we can get rid of this. He'll even buy a printing press. He'll start his own newspaper. Of course, he marries Anna, the one that had helped free him for slavery. But the thing is that he starts to go out and speak, and he gives these wonderful tours, and he tells people about, that he's this fugitive slave that has declared himself free. And Ray, some of the people that he starts speaking to don't believe him. They don't think that he's really who he says he is, and so he has to begin writing, and one of the things that he'll do is write over and over and over numerous books, but he'll write this first book, which is called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. And the whole purpose of writing that first book is, I'm proving to you that I am who I said that I am. Mm-hmm. He gives names, he gives locations, he gives dates, but he is like, my message is very important because I've lived it and I've seen it and I've experienced it, and therefore I am able to come out to you and to talk to you about it.
Yeah, when you think about his autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, he starts in that book and he says this, and I think this shows that even at a very young age, he was looking at his situation going, I've got to change this. He says, and I quote, "From my earliest recollection, I date the entertainment of a deep conviction that slavery would not always be to hold me within its foul embrace. And in the darkest hours of my career in slavery, this living word of faith and spirit of hope departed not from me, but remained like ministering angels to cheer me through the gloom." So even in his darkest days, when he was being transferred from farm to farm, even when he was being whipped and mistreated and separated from his parents, he still had the hope that one day he would be free. And of course, when he meets Anna and he moves north, and he gets involved in the abolitionist movement there. And it wasn't a movement that was safe necessarily, even in the north. He got attacked on a regular basis. One time he had his hand broken. I forget which hand it was. I believe it was his left hand. He was beat so bad his hand was broken, and he lost use of that hand for the most part. But he's going to gain a reputation for being a well-spoken abolitionist, and he's actually going to spend some time in Ireland and in Great Britain, where in England he's going to give the so-called London reception speech, where he talks, and we're going to talk here in a little minute about a speech he gave here in the United States. But in this London reception speech, he says, and I quote, "What is to be thought of a nation boasting of its liberty, boasting of its humanity, boasting of its Christianity, boasting of its love of justice and purity, and yet having within its own borders 3 million of persons denied by law the right of marriage," end quote. And and he's going to say some of the same things in speeches in America, basically like, America, you've done a lot of good things, but you got a really big problem here. And that really big problem was that of slavery. And he said, look, it undercuts everything you claim about yourself, whether it be a nation of liberty, a nation of freedom, or a nation of Christianity. It just totally undercuts it.
Yeah, and he used trials and tribulations to get his point across. Mm-hmm. I mean, the reason that he's in Ireland, in England, is because he is still a fugitive slave, and people are still after him. And even more so because he is not just a former slave, but he's an educated former slave. And he's an educated former slave who is talking about the treatment of slaves. He's witnessed it, he's seen it, and he's not just speaking about it, but he's writing about it. And so you have all of these slave catchers that are on the loose. I mean, bounties are all on the head of Frederick Douglass. And here's something that's interesting is Frederick Douglass, it will be the most photographed black man during this particular period. He's even more photographed than Abraham Lincoln.
Yes.
And as he is being photographed, his picture is out there. So people can't not know who Frederick Douglass is. So remember when we were talking about David Walker from Wilmington and David Walker's appeal? Well, David Walker really didn't have an image that was out there. People didn't really know what he looked like. Frederick Douglass, everybody knew what he looked like. So everybody's looking for him, they're seeking him, but yet he uses his platform to go out and to say, here's what's going on in America, and you need to be aware of this, and you need to be, not just aware of it, but be involved in what is happening. And he actually has European allies that will actually help him in his crusade and in his pursuit. And then he finds the likings of really powerful, influential people in the abolitionist movement who are saying, hey, wait a second, this guy's got a voice, he's got a story, and he can really help our movement. And it will not be long before Frederick Douglass really rises into the ranks and has some really good relationships with people, one of them also being the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, and it's not just going to be slavery. It's not just going to be,
Right.
promoting abolition. He's going to promote women's rights. In 1848 in New York, he's going to be the only African American to attend the Senecal Falls convention there, which of course was a convention of women's rights advocates, and that's what he's going to be promoting as well. So he's not just promoting anti-slavery, freedom for the slaves, he's also promoting women's rights. He was someone who was promoting freedom and liberty for everybody, not just, white men of the time.
Yeah, and remember, he's doing this up in the North.
Yeah.
And so, people know their history might be thinking, well, surely he's getting a better reception up north than he would be if he was down south. And while he did have some people that appreciated what he was saying, there was still a lot of people up north who maybe were against slavery, but still didn't think that the black man should have the same rights as a white man. And one occasion was Frederick Douglass had just given a speech, and he was walking in the park with a white lady who worked for him at the newspaper. And there are reports that maybe they were arm in arm, but they were walking close to each other. And for several individuals who saw a black man walking with a white woman being close and having, hospitality and chatting, it nerved them, and they became very upset with it and actually went and hit him and abused him and even her. And there were people just watching this go by, and Frederick Douglass was like, this is what I'm talking about. It is not just about slavery, but it's the way that we're treating humanity. The Declaration of Independence, which he loved and he appreciated, but he said, I'm not going to talk about the Declaration of Independence and about the rights, natural rights that are given to all people of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, if you're just going to walk up and beat somebody just for the color of their skin. He said, I cannot support one way and then allow you to do something else. That's this moral crisis that is affecting this nation at this time. And you have an individual who is willing to step up, stand up, speak up about it, regardless of what even might happen to him as a result.
Yeah, you know what he did, and we're going to be talking here about a speech he gave in Rochester, New York on July 5, 1852. The speech was called, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. And he starts out this speech, Chris, by talking about the Declaration of Independence, by talking about the founders and the framers of the United States. And he has very good things to say about them. Look at what they did. He said, quote, they went so far in their excitement as to pronounce the measures of government of Great Britain, of course, unjust, unreasonable, and oppressive, and altogether such as ought not to be quietly submitted to. I scarcely need say, fellow citizens, that my opinion of these measures fully accords with that of your fathers. End quote. So in other words, he takes the argument that the United States made during the American Revolution, we want to be free from this overbearing British power. We want to be free from this arbitrary British power in which we have no say, we have no representation. And he says, look, your founders, your framers, they separated from that. They moved away from that. And they did the right thing, he makes clear. And then, Chris, he turns and he says, that's all great and good, but we've got a big problem here, and that's the problem of slavery.
Yeah, I think when we look at this speech, and this is probably his greatest speech, and it's not just his greatest speech, but it's one that I would invite our listeners. It's a little lengthy, but
Yeah.
it is very, very important. But not just important in the way that he says it, but in the words, but it's just the way of the movement of it. And so this takes place in 1852, and he's invited by the Rochester ladies. And basically, I think it's kind of interesting that the ladies come to him and say, Frederick, we would love for you to give us a 4th of July address.
Yeah.
And Frederick says, I tell you what, I am more than happy to give you an address. I will do it, but I can only do it on July 5th. And they're like, but we want it on July 4th. And he said, I'm not going to do it on July 5th, but I'll do it on I won't do it on July 4th, but I will do it on July 5th. Because, Ray, for many of the black men during this period, and black women, July 5th was the day, especially in New York City, where they had this large parade where I think it was about 4,000 African Americans had walked down the streets celebrating the end of slavery. And so they saw July 5th as a holiday more so than July 4th. But the way that he frames this speech, I guess, Ray, the best way we could talk about it is in two contexts. The first one, you could look at it as far as a preacher, where the preacher starts off with a really nice illustration to kind of get you in the mood, and he gets you comfortable. And then he kind of hammers it home for you, and then he's got a flowery end that says, okay, you can do this now. Or you can look at it in the framework of music. And now you're the music guy. You can probably tune this into some kind of Def Leppard way, maybe. But if you think about it as far as a symphony or an orchestra, there are these elements of music. There are these movements that take you. And you mentioned that first movement, which is, it's a putting them at ease. It's acknowledging the founding fathers thing is good. But in that second movement, he brings the hammer down. And for like 14 pages of his speech, the longest movement out of this, he just rails on everything that is going on. He pulls no punches. I mean, he is just... And by the way, remember, he is speaking to abolitionists. He is speaking to people that are technically in agreement with him, but they are squirming. And they are just like, oh my gosh, as he's just dragging them through this litany of, contradiction after contradiction of what America is all about. It's this hypocrisy of slavery and racism and what's known as a republic. And I just think that, as you look at it, as you mentioned earlier, the way that he uses you and yours, and, he says the 4th of July is yours,
right,
not mine. You may rejoice, but I must mourn. Imagine telling that as a fugitive slave, educated, to a group of 600 white people. I mean, I can only imagine, first of all, the bravery that must have went into giving that speech. And that was the second movement of the speech. And then, he'll then eventually go into that third movement.
Yeah, he talks about in here, you talk about him speaking to this large group of people, white people here. But he says something here that does catch my eye. Because he says, quote, "Oh, had I the ability and could reach the nation's ear." And this goes back to what you were talking about bringing the hammer down. "I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not a gentle shower, but thunder." And he just lays into the issue of slavery, which he said, look, that's my topic here. He starts out, like you said, he sort of wines and dines them in the first part, and then he comes in. My topic, by the way, today is going to be American slavery. And he points the finger at the people in front of him, and he says, this is your responsibility now. He says, and I quote, "Your fathers," speaking of the framers and all of them, "your fathers have lived, died, and done their work, and have done much of it well. You live and must die, and you must do your work." End quote. So he basically just says, it's your time now.
Yeah, and just to be clear, that he's speaking to a lot of do-good Christians.
Yeah.
I mean, he's speaking to the church, and he was like, you're a hypocrite because you're saying love one another, bear with one another, forgive one another, care for one another. You're saying do all of this, but you're only doing it for the white person, and you're not doing it for the black person. And so he doesn't just limit, where he's going, and he uses biblical passages. He talks about the slavery of the Jews. He refers to by the rivers of Babylon how we wept and how we mourned. And so, he pulls back this Jeremiah and Isaiah. So he's using material that these people know about, that they've studied about, that they have heard. And he's using it and he's saying, this is not past history. This is present history. This is right here, right now. And yes, your hands are full of blood. And yes, you bear responsibility to this. But there is a third movement. He doesn't end there. He's got this calm, firm embrace that says, listen, I love two things in life. Number one, I love the Bible. And number two, I love the Constitution.
Yep.
And I love both of those things. And both of those things have principles and they have purposes and they are liberty documents. But we're not living by them. But here's our chance. This is your time. This is our moment where things can end. And so he ends this third movement, or this speech, in the third movement with a message or a vision, if you will, of hope.
Yeah, he does. And he says, I do not despair of this country. And he basically says, look, I'm not without hope. And he makes this point at other points throughout the speech, but he says, I'm not without hope. But he's still, in the end, he still says, a change must come now. This has got to change now. And this is just a very powerful speech from Frederick Douglass. And like we said early on in this episode, we'd encourage you to go read it. Read it for yourself. Read the whole thing. It is a very important speech, not just simply for his time, but for all time.
Yeah, and he gives it to 600 people. And by the way, so when he's finished, and he drops the mic, if you will, and he goes to sit down, the reporters state that those 600 white Northerners, first of all, their mouths had to have been to the floor listening to this. But at the end of the speech,
what did we ask for here?
Right. Yeah, we asked you to come, and this is what we got. But at the end of the speech, every single one in that room stood up. And it says that there was a universal burst of applause. Knowing, yes, we've done wrong. Yes, we need to fix it. The problem is, how do you fix it? How do you take that next step? And this is not just a speech that's to these people. He will actually then go and have it printed. By the way, remember, he's got this newspaper, and the newspaper's not doing very well. So he goes and he sells them for 50 cents a copy or $6 for 100. And, he uses this speech because, he says this is valuable. This is what everybody needs to hear, not just a group of white Northerners that are here at the Lady Society, but the entire nation and world need to hear of the moral crisis in America and what we can do to fix it.
Yeah, and he leaves that speech and he continues his work, and he's actually going to sort of rise not just simply to national fame in the sense of the abolitionist movement, but he's going to get involved in the presidential level. He is an early supporter, of course, of President Abraham Lincoln, especially in the early years of the Civil War. But as the Civil War sort of moves on, he's going to sort of have some disagreements with Lincoln, maybe thinking Lincoln's a little bit too timid on the issue. But I want to, Chris, go back to something that happened at Lincoln's inauguration. Because Abraham Lincoln's inaugurated in 1861, and Abraham Lincoln's vice president is a guy from Tennessee, a guy called Andrew Johnson. And we did 2 episodes on Andrew Johnson, Chris, way back when, it seems like 5 years ago, on his impeachment. But this is a time when, at the inauguration, Andrew Johnson is there. And, of course, we know Andrew Johnson showed up drunk at the inauguration. And a real class act there. But Johnson didn't know who Frederick Douglass was. And when they're on stage, Lincoln is standing there beside Andrew Johnson, and he points out Frederick Douglass in the crowd. And Frederick Douglass says this, and I'll quote, "There are moments in the lives of most men when the doors of their souls are open, and unconsciously to themselves, their true character may be read by the observant eye. It was at such an instant when I caught a glimpse of the real nature of this man," speaking of Andrew Johnson, "which all subsequent developments proved true. I was standing in the crowd by the side of Miss Thomas J. Dorsey when Mr. Lincoln touched Mr. Johnson and pointed me out to him. The first expression which came to his face, and which I think was the true index of his heart, was one of bitter contempt and aversion. Seeing that I had observed him, he tried to assume a more friendly appearance, but it was too late. It is useless to close the door when all within had been seen. His first glance was the frown of the man. The second was the bland and sickly smile of a demagogue. I turned to Miss Dorsey and said, 'Whatever Andrew Johnson may be, he is no friend of our race,'" end quote. And like Frederick says, everything that's going to follow in the years to come in throughout Andrew Johnson's presidency is going to prove over and over again that Frederick Douglass got a true measure of that man.
Yeah, I think we have to ask ourselves, because we are living in a climate that is very unstable right now as it comes to some of these core issues that we're still discussing. Rights to vote, rights of same equal treatment for all people. And Frederick Douglass gave one of the greatest speeches of American history. And I think it is so timely even for today. And that's why for the third time, we encourage individuals to read this speech, because in this speech, he explains the nation's historical condition, how we established a new nation. We removed ourselves from tyranny. We thought about injustice being wrong, and we sought to bring about a new nation that was, for all intents and purposes, under God, with the rights to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness and all of these things. But what's happened is we've strayed away from those purposes. We've strayed away from what the intended goal was of those founding fathers, who were not perfect and should not be seen as perfect people, but were people who saw an opportunity to do something great, to do something for this nation. And though it might not have been in the best way, in the best manner at all times, they gave everything that they had. And Frederick Douglass acknowledges that.
Yeah.
But we've lost our focus. And I think if Frederick Douglass was alive today, I think that he would still use the beautiful gift of words that he has, and that he would want to go out and he would say, why are we still at this? Why are we still at this point where we're separated instead of united? Why are we still having all of these particular things? And I think he would ask again for another altar call, that he would encourage his people and for all of us who were Americans to recognize that the core of liberty is equality for all people. And he would try to illuminate a path to a better way, to a better day. And so I think as we look at the story of Frederick Douglass, his words still ring true today.
Yeah.
He ended it by citing 4 verses from an abolitionist poem called The Triumph of Freedom. But in that final few words in that speech, he said these words, and I quote, "God speed the year of Jubilee, the wide world o'er, until that year, day, hour arrive, with head and heart and hand, I'll strive." What a timely message for all of us in today's society. To use our heads, to use our hearts, and to use our hands, and to come together and to bring about equality and liberty, just as the founding fathers had envisioned it.
And that's ultimately what Frederick Douglass wanted. He wanted people united, not divided, but united. Chris, thank you for a great episode. I hope our listeners enjoyed today's episode. If you'd like to contact us, you can always contact us through email, historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know, @gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on Twitter, Sounder FM, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and many other places, Chris. So until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.